is, from my point of view, a really key stepping stone in the long journey of reconciliation. There are so many steps in that journey, but this is a really important one. My name is Jackie Larkin. I know a number of you, but not everybody, and I'll just be moderating the session. The big speakers are not me. And I want to just acknowledge right at the beginning that I'm a first generation, I call myself a settler, but other folks say newcomer, others say arrivant. We have different words that we use, and that's okay. That's part of the journey itself. I'm living on and working on and loving this land, this unceded Coast Salish territory, which has been unceded, by the Chianu peoples since time immemorial. I'm grateful for all that I can learn about how to care for this land. So this session tonight is a community presentation and discussion about how Indigenous-led protected areas are becoming a leading kind of community-centered approach to meeting conservation goals in Canada and regions across the world, to helping to mitigate climate change and promoting community well-being. So that's a pretty important and a big task for all of us. So before we start the presentations, a little more overview on what we're going to be doing this evening and a little detail about process. So this has been sponsored by Habitat Acquisition Trust, who have this beautiful banner up front, and there's materials out front there too, which has been, as I understand it, directing conservation of land since 1996 in the southern part of this island and doing an enormous amount of really important work. And HAT has partnered with a much smaller and newer group called the Metchosin Learning Group, which I'm part of, which organizes events and initiatives in this community to explore the ways that we can learn and unlearn some of the ways that we can act to support more respectful relations with First Nations communities. More on from both those organizations at the end of the session today. I'd also like to acknowledge the funders of this event, the All One Fund, the Metcalf Foundation, and the Peter Gilgan Foundation, whose funds helped to make this evening possible. I'd also like to acknowledge that there are some members of council here, and we're glad that they could attend. And I'm understanding, as long as I haven't missed anybody, that we have with us today Shelley Donaldson. You want to maybe put your hand up for those of you who don't know you. Steve Gray and Jay Shukin. Steve Gray is over there and Jay here. So maybe if you want to be talking with them afterwards, they're here. Thank you for coming. So the keynote today is a presentation by Jessica Hum on Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And you're probably going to hear the phrase IPCA through the evening because it takes a lot over the tongue to keep saying Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So get used to IPCA. And then it'll be followed by a brief presentation and specific update on Mary Hill, provided by Morgan Yates, who's a volunteer with HAT, and Morgan is in the back of the room, well, almost the back of the room there. Both the presentations will be followed by a question and answer period. If you go from here with unanswered questions, which will maybe be the case for all of us, one of the places you can go is to the Mary Hill website to ask those questions and get responses. So our goal is to get grounded on the possibilities that IPCAs can offer, not only in British Columbia, but beyond, and in fact, around the world. But we're here, most of us, in fact, I'm assuming maybe all of us, but I should not make the assumption, are newcomers or settlers on this Chianu land. And I'm imagining, have different perspectives among us. And I'm pretty sure that we would probably, many of us, have different perspectives than the Indigenous people who've lived here for millennia. And we're in a process of beginning to repair and rebuild relationships that were a couple of hundred years in the making. So that takes time. And we acknowledge that there might be some anxiety that folks might have about Mary Hill, which is the last part of this session today, because some people may feel that this is a land that they hold very dear and that they wish to protect. But we are neighbors with different histories. And so we're starting from different places. So I'm really hoping, and my job here is to support you in being really open to learning, to being curious and respectful, and to do this journey together with a spirit of curiosity and with an open heart. So just hoping that we can stay with that kind of framing for the whole evening. We did not advertise this event outside of Metchosin because we wanted to respect Chianu's wishes that it be a Metchosin-centric event. We're also committed to ensuring that Chianu has the time and the space to engage and inform and go through whatever process their own community requires. And that means that, especially for those of us who are used to getting things done, that the process will probably be slower than the one that we're used to, or the ones we're used to. So Jessica's keynote will be 45 minutes, followed by questions and answers, and then we'll have the update from Morgan on Mary Hill for 10 minutes, followed by questions and answers, and then a very brief closing. And the only guidelines for participation, in addition to the respectful open heart that I've asked you to find within yourselves, which I'm sure is already there, is to manage the time when we have the question period to keep your questions succinct and brief, to keep them to about a minute if you can do that, because we want to maximize the number of questions that we can get responses to. We're also asking everybody to, when they do ask a question, to give their name and whether they're a resident of Metchosin. And yes, I mentioned that you can go to the website, but I don't think I need to say that anymore now. So having done all of the preliminaries, oh, you know what I didn't do is tell you where the washrooms are, which maybe everybody does know, but are you telling me where the washrooms are, or are you telling me something else there, Allison?
Turn off the back and only to the left.
The washrooms are to the left, yes. The thing that I didn't mention was the video. Is that what you wanted to, Allison?
That's what you wanted. I'm saying turn off your phones.
Okay, so we are videoing this. I skipped you, and I'm so sorry about that. We are videoing this session, and Peter Ord from HAT is sort of kind of holding it all together, but we're videoing and recording it. So we would like your permission to do a couple of pans of the audience, but we won't do that if anybody doesn't want that to happen. So I know I'm putting you on the spot, but is there anybody here who does not want to appear in a pan of the audience video? It will be very brief. And you'd rather not, okay? So can you do the video without getting that corner?
Yeah.
Okay, is that, you're the only person making sure? Okay, that's great. Thank you. And sorry for skipping that out. I jumped ahead of my own presentation. And so now let me introduce Jessica, which I'm very excited to do. Jessica Hum, who is sitting right here, and she'll be right up front very soon. She was born on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe-Waki to a diverse family that identifies as Chinese Arrivant and Ojibwe ancestry, so a very rich ancestral history to bring to this. She lives on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Wasanich, Senchatan, and Lekwungen-speaking peoples. She brings a decade of professional experience in planning and collaborations with Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. She founded Talking Circle Consultants in 2021 to deepen our relationships through the exchange of stories, exploring the old and new ways to connect with one another, and reconnecting planning to place, which really intrigued me. I thought, yes, connecting planning to place is what we should have been doing a long time ago. So it's our pleasure and our honor to have you with us tonight. Jessica, you're on. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Jackie, for that introduction and for the invitation for us to start by opening our hearts, our minds, and our bodies to be here tonight. So I'd like to do a little exercise with you all that we can participate together. I'd like to invite us all to take a moment first to go inward, to lower our gaze or close the eyes if that feels comfortable, and start to just deepen the breath. If we can all take a deep breath in together, and then just let that go. Let go of the distractions of the day to just be here and arrive and be present. And with your eyes closed or the gaze lowered, I invite you to imagine a place that is important to you, that you hold special. And this place can be a place where people and nature coexist in harmony. In your mind's eye, I want you to picture this place and imagine how people steward the relationships those connections between humans and the relationships with more than human beings. This is a place where the laws of the land and the waters, the cycles of the sun and the moon and the tides, they govern people's relationships with the land and the sea. And that natural law, it means that people hold their relationships in balance with important life-sustaining plants and animals. And in this place, there's an abundance of biodiversity. And yet, people are mindful in their harvests so that this abundance continues for many generations into the future. I now invite you to open your eyes again and take a look at this picture here of a nurse log sheltering the growth of new fungi, and just how those special places can nurture new growth in our lives and in the lives of more than human beings. And let's remember that since time immemorial, as Jackie has said, Indigenous law has applied to those relationships between humans and the relationships with more than human beings. Humans and other beings have continued to be affected by the impacts of colonization, by the laws that humans have created, like Crown Law, that we have unwisely placed higher than natural law. And Indigenous peoples have had their relationships with more than human beings severed and have been cut off from the stewardship of lands and waters. So we're here today to learn more about and explore how Indigenous people around the world are reestablishing those relationships through what's called Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Ani Jessica Hum, Indigenacas, Alice Cozier, Izinakazu, Nokamis, Onjaba, Nea Shinigiming, Indigu, Tamdakun. I'm Jessica Hum. I've introduced myself in my two grandmother's languages. In Anishinaabe, in the Ojibwe-Moan language, my grandmother, Alice Cozier, was from the Chippewas of the Nawash unceded First Nations in Ontario. And in Cantonese, my grandmother who raised me and gave me my Chinese name, Tam Dakun, which means to speak ethics gracefully. I was born on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe in Toronto, Ontario, and I'm third generation Ojibwe Chinese. I'm a visitor, an uninvited guest to the unceded ancestral territories of many nations, including the Wasanich and the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, colonially known as Victoria, BC. I'm a lifelong student of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I'm a bit of an IPCA nerd. I'm learning about this role and these important steps through formal academic studies with Vancouver Island University. And I'm continuously learning from knowledge keepers and elders in the places that I'm fortunate to live, work, and learn from coast to coast to coast during my past studies in resource and environmental management. Miigwech, and with gratitude to the Chenu people who have stewarded these lands since time before mine. I don't represent the Chenu or any nation here today. I'm here representing myself and my work as Talking Circle consultants who've invited me with Habitat Acquisition Trust and the Metchosin Learning Group to give this presentation to you tonight. So, what are we going to hear about tonight? What you can expect is that we will be here. My purpose is to inform and to share information about Indigenous protected and conserved areas as a global movement right here in Canada, in BC, and in South Vancouver Island. IPCAs are a community-centered approach to meet our global conservation goals. And we'll look at the 3 conditions for biodiversity conservation. Canada has also made commitments to meeting biodiversity conservation, and I'll share examples from my lived experience visiting some of these places. And we'll also look at reconciliation in the context of IPCAs, how IPCAs support Indigenous rights and responsibilities in reconciling our relationships with one another and with the land. My intention for you is that by the end of this presentation tonight, you'll better understand IPCAs, and you will be hopeful about the tools and mechanisms that exist for establishment, for governance and for management of IPCAs. So, what's the urgency? We are facing climate change that is unprecedented change to land, water, and living beings on Earth. And we have accelerated biodiversity loss in the Anthropocene, in the era of humans. Without a change in course, we're going to see permanent biocultural loss of migration routes and corridors for culturally significant species. For example, the work of Habitat Acquisition Trust is in service of a future where the full array of natural habitats on South Vancouver Island and Southern Gulf Islands are healthy and conserved. So to do so, there is an urgent need for us to change our ways, to become more resilient, to adapt, and to mitigate climate change. There is so much that we can learn from Indigenous peoples, life ways, and many generations of adaptation. We also have so much to learn from our past. Here is an example that typifies what is not an IPCA. I'm going to read this quote from Chief Mikisew Justin Martin. The story of Wood Buffalo National Park is when Chief Mikisew Justin Martin and two headmen signed Treaty 8 in 1899 on behalf of the Mikisew. They did so with the understanding that their people would be free to continue their way of life. Chief Mikisew agreed to allow the bison to roam based on the promise that Mikisew would be allowed to harvest bison once population numbers were sufficient. This led to the establishment of the park in 1922. The promise that Mikisew would be allowed to harvest bison was never honored. Hunting these animals is still banned. And in this example, Parks Canada has imposed a set of regulations that carries the namesake wood buffalo, which is the common name for bison, an important cultural keystone species for the Mikisew Cree First Nation and many Indigenous peoples in this area. And yet it still remains illegal for Indigenous people to practice their cultural practices in the national park. Canada has a long history of stories like this, of exclusion and separation of Indigenous peoples from their relationships and their responsibilities to lands and lifeways. Beginning with European arrival and settlement of land, it became enshrined in Crown law to displace Indigenous peoples from the areas that they traditionally stewarded. We can think of First Nation reserve lands and Métis script and forced displacement of Inuit and enfranchisement to reduce membership, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Indian hospital medical experiments, and kidnapping children into residential schools. These are just some of the truths that Indigenous people, our ancestors, have lived through in efforts to reduce and eliminate our people. This was done systematically through Crown law, as well as through the creation of national and provincial parks and wilderness areas that excluded people. There is a better way. Tonight, we're going to look at how some of these ways that IPCAs are helping us to reach our global and domestic conservation goals. I'm going to show you examples of how IPCAs are doing this in ways that also support reconciliation with Indigenous people and help us all to heal our relationships with one another and heal our relationships with the land. First, let's explore some of the background on these goals. So in 2010, the parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity met in Aichi, Japan, and the parties set out a plan with multiple targets. Some of you may have heard of Aichi Target 11, which states that by 2020, 17% of terrestrial and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved through effectively and equitably managed and ecologically representative, well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective conservation measures. And then in 2015, Canada initiated a process to fulfill this goal. This domestic initiative was developed as Canada's pathway to Target 1, that through networks of IPCAs, through protected areas, and other effective conservation measures, our goal has grown. And Canada's new target is 30% of lands and waters protected by 2030. To get us to these goals, Canada saw a need to establish an advisory body to Canada's pathway to Target 1. Hence, Canada brought together a group to explore the relationships from coast to coast to coast, including Indigenous innovators and non-Indigenous peoples being employees in governments and NGOs in 4 regions across Canada, from the north to the east, central, and west. As part of that process, the Indigenous Circle of Experts, also known as ICE, was established to explore the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas through this country. So I do have a 90-second video clip that I want to play, which just features here, in his own words, the co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, Eli Enns, who is a Clayoquot Nation member, thank you, Peter, and he's speaking alongside co-founder of the Isaac Olam Foundation, Monica Shore. In their own words, they demystify IPCAs and the 3 essential elements. So let's hear from them.
What are Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs? Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, are lands and waters where Indigenous governments have the primary role in protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. Culture and language are the heart and soul of an IPCA.
IPCAs isn't something that the provincial or federal government is going to try to do to Indigenous peoples. IPCAs, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, are a tool that's available for Indigenous governments, for Indigenous nations to forward their own biodiversity protection and promotion objectives. IPCAs can only work if it's self-determined by Indigenous peoples themselves.
We Rise Together, the report released by the Indigenous Circle of Experts in 2018 as part of the Canada Pathway to Target 1 process, identifies 3 essential elements of IPCAs. They are Indigenous-led, they represent a long-term commitment to conservation, and they elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities. Because Indigenous peoples have been caring for their lands and waters since time immemorial, all Indigenous nations would have areas within their territories that could qualify as IPCAs.
Okay, so that was just the one part of the video clip I wanted to show, because in their report, We Rise Together, the pathways to Canada Target 1 through the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas in the spirit and practice of reconciliation. Thanks, Jackie. The Indigenous Circle of Experts distinguishes IPCAs from parks, wilderness, and conservation areas. IPCAs are, first and foremost, Indigenous-led. They are Indigenous-led. They are Indigenous-led, they elevate Indigenous responsibilities and rights, and they represent a commitment to conservation in the long term. And all of this means that natural law, the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the tides, and the governance of the relationships between humans and more than humans are emphasized. In recognition that the ways that Indigenous people have had their relationships severed are trying to be repaired. In some places, the health of the ecosystem has not been monitored or stewarded by people in general for many generations. So healing the land and our relationships with the land needs to be one of those first steps. I do have another short video clip that we'll attempt, and this is in his own words, Hereditary Chief Frank Brown, who's a member of the Heiltsuk Nation from Bella Bella. And I share this video because Frank Brown has formed extensive partnerships with educational institutions. It's one of those hybrid models that we'd love to see more of. Chief Frank Brown is from the Heiltsuk Tribal Council, and he's a leader in revitalizing cultural connections to the sea. He was instrumental in planning the tribal journeys to Bella Bella in 1993 and 2014. Some of you have heard that the tribal journeys are happening right now this week. In Chief Brown's own words, he describes the importance and the concept of biocultural diversity. So let's hear from Chief Frank Brown.
We have to make biodiversity meaningful and connected to our humanity. Biodiversity means things that we need to survive. My name is Frank Brown. I'm from the Heiltsuk First Nation in the central coast of British Columbia. Our people, like many other Indigenous people in the world, recognize that critical interconnectedness that we have with all plants and animals. We're not above those creatures. The Heiltsuk people have lived in this region according to carbon dating for over 14,000 years. You know, we had the ability to harvest all of the resources, but we didn't. What we're attempting to do is to move forward, honoring our ancestral teachings, but also incorporating the best of what Western science has to offer. Cultural diversity mirrors biodiversity in the natural world. If we destroy cultural diversity and biodiversity, we are limiting our options for the future. The Indigenous people of the land can help Canada fulfill its commitment to biological conservation through Indigenous protected and conserved areas. We can be the eyes and ears on the land through guardian programs. We need to revisit our values so that we can conserve biodiversity to make sure that there's enough there for our future generations.
Right now, I want to take us on a journey around the world. And here's 3 examples of IPCAs that I shortlisted for us to visit and explore. In Australia, the Great Barrier Reef and the Indigenous Women's Guardians. In New Zealand, Aotearoa, the Wanganui River and Legal Personhood. And the US-Canada Transboundary Initiative, the Blackfoot Confederacy, ENI, or Bison Initiative. Have any of you been to any of these places? Show of hands? Wow, okay, yes, thank you, so have I. Think back to the beginning of this presentation, when we closed our eyes and you imagined a special place. And remember the qualities of those relationships between people and people stewarding those places. These 3 places stood out to me because they are important biocultural places where Indigenous peoples are front and center in establishing, co-managing, and co-governing these protected areas. They also are in our unique brand of colonization and following suit under Crown law. They each have a unique story to tell. So, you've probably all heard about the Great Barrier Reef, World Heritage Area, and its beauty for tourism and importance for marine biodiversity. But what you may not know is that caring for country is a concept that Australia is leading, where Indigenous communities are declaring protected areas over their traditional lands and waters. And fire management plays a huge role in how Indigenous people in Australia are caring for their lands. They're preventing out-of-control bushfires through Indigenous wisdom and practices. And this is part of the Land and Sea Rangers caring for country. The Rangers, or what we call in Canada the Guardian model, is financially supported by Crown and Indigenous governments. And now there's a traditional owner reef protection fund that is set up to support rangers in their work to steward the Great Barrier Reef, according to Indigenous laws and protocols. In 2022, this group pictured on the right of Indigenous women who were protecting the Great Barrier Reef were awarded 1 million Great British pounds as part of the Prince of Wales Earthshot Fund. And what this means is that Queensland Indigenous Women's Rangers can expand their education programs and involve young women and girls as the next generation of female-led Indigenous Rangers. That's pretty cool, hey? So next, let's visit Aotearoa, New Zealand, and let me tell you about the Wanganui River. It's an area that's protected from mountain to sea. And the Wanganui River people say, "From the mountains to sea, I am the river, and the river is me." The Wanganui River is protected just as people are under Maori law and Crown law in New Zealand. It's co-managed by the Crown and the Wanganui iwi, the iwi being a local government and community, using the lens of Maori understanding of responsibility and relationships to the sacred rights of the river. And this sacred rights includes the path of the river from the top of Mount Tongariro to the sea, a span of a total of 180 miles. The chairperson of the Wanganui River Settlement, Gerald Albert, says, "The river isn't just water and sand, it's an ancestral being with its own integrity. This river is not the river that has been contended by the Crown that exists in compartments, its bed and its waters. It is an indivisible whole that includes iwi. So this concept of legal personhood is the nearest approximation in the way that which we can relate to our people as being inextricably entwined to it and can never be alienated from it." And thirdly, let's come closer to home, where the Blackfoot Confederacy is establishing a transboundary protected area in southern Alberta and northern Montana. The 4 tribes of Blackfoot, North Pagan, Siksika Nation, and the Kainai Blood Tribe have gotten together to protect their ini, which is the name for bison. We're circling back here and reflecting on the fortress conservation model of Wood Buffalo Park, and the opposite here, where Indigenous people are protecting not just this species, but one of the most transformed landscapes, where agriculture and industrial development have severed relationships with free-roaming bison. And instead, the INI initiative is Blackfoot-led conservation in its efforts to restore Indigenous protocols and stewardship to Blackfoot traditional territory. So let's move from our global to here, right here on these lands, closer to home. This is the map of the 3 conditions that was developed by Harvey Locke and team. The title of the research is 3 Global Conditions for Biodiversity Conservation and Sustainable Use. And I show this map because it mirrors what we have here in Canada. Harvey Locke and team support that 3 conditions should be considered in establishing protected areas. And they compel us to establish IPCAs in all 3 of these regions. If we consider that the southern regions are where the majority of our urban and agricultural uses are, then our IPCAs should focus on rehabilitation, on restoration, and specifically land securement at key pinch points and along our coastal systems. At the mid-latitudes, IPCAs should be strengthening and integrating corridors and wildlife travel routes as considerations into existing policies and practices, and where partnerships of co-management and co-governance will be key. We're going to touch on some of those later in tonight's presentation. And also in the north, where we have areas of large protected areas, we have opportunities for broad corridors to be established, for large connected protected areas, conserved areas through land planning, which many Northern Indigenous communities are pursuing already. So let's recall the 3 essential elements of IPCAs, that they are Indigenous-led, that they elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities, and that they represent a long-term commitment to conservation. In our Canadian context, how do we go about this? First, we can do our homework and investigate in ourselves, in our communities, and how we are supporting, hindering, questioning, and learning about honoring the treaties, our treaties with natural law, our treaties under Crown law, and treaties under Aboriginal law, which is Crown law applied to Indigenous peoples. We can also learn more about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also known as UNDRIP, and about current legislation here in BC and how that's being enacted through the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also known as DRIPA. And we can seek to better understand how modern treaties are being created and formed today under the BC Modern Treaties process, memorandums of understanding, and other reconciliation agreements. That's a big word, reconciliation. Speaking of reconciliation, what does it mean to you? And what should it mean to all Canadians? Here's one interpretation from the summary report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. In the face of growing conflicts over lands, resources, and economic development, the scope of reconciliation must extend beyond residential schools to encompass all aspects of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations and connections to the land. To quote the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, the appointed chair of the TRC Commission, whose Ojibwe name, Mizane Gizik, means the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. He says, reconciliation is about atonement, it's about making amends, it's about apology, it's about recognizing responsibility. It's about accounting for what has gone on. It's ultimately about commitment to maintaining that mutually respectful relationship throughout, recognizing that even when you establish it, there will be challenges to it. And why is this important? Because reconciliation is not just required between people in society, it's also required between us, between our humanity and the land. So next, let's circle back to the Indigenous Circle of Experts and the hurdles that they identified on the pathways towards reconciliation. Foremoose is a wordplay on the familiar concept of elephants in the room. And the Cambridge Dictionary defines elephants in the room as an obvious problem or a difficult situation that people don't want to talk about. In the context of IPCAs, the four moose represent four crucial but potentially difficult topics that must be addressed in order for IPCAs to succeed. The first is jurisdiction, which is the ability to make decisions and laws, and to ensure that those laws are upheld on the land, because IPCAs are often in areas of contested, overlapping, multiple transboundary jurisdictions, as I've just shown you a few examples. This moose here of jurisdiction refers to the need for Crown governments and Indigenous peoples to share in the jurisdictional responsibilities to care for the land. The second is financial solutions, and there is a defined need for sustainable and long-term financial solutions for both initial establishment, those first steps, and the ongoing living stewardship and maintenance of IPCAs long into the future, lest they become paper parks that are just protected areas on paper. The third is building the technical, cultural, and spiritual capacity, those skills and experiences that benefit. Thank you. Technical capacity building that benefits both the supports Indigenous people who are developing IPCAs and benefits the IPCA in general. So this could be language and cultural practices, environmental monitoring and guardianship programs, and cultural competency training for non-Indigenous staff as well. The fourth and final moose that the ICE team discovered was cultural keystone species and places. And these are important that they come together. These are the species and places of importance for cultural identity and well-being of people and their abilities to be on the land and keep in relationship with land. This could be cultural sites, sacred burial sites, important sites for harvesting at different times of year, and migration routes that are important for people and animals. This next quote from the Indigenous Circle of Experts report describes why the four moose are so important to integrate into the development of IPCAs. It was clear from the outset that to develop the concept of IPCAs as a living example of reconciliation, and for ICE's potential contributions to the pathway to Canada Target 1, for the process to succeed, there had to be careful and direct consideration of the four moose. So to illustrate how there are Indigenous people right here in Canada overcoming those barriers, addressing them, each of the four moose, here are 4 examples of IPCAs that are closer to home. The first place we'll travel to is Thai-Denenene in Denendeh, Northwest Territories, a place that I have visited and hold special in my heart, especially today, as there are many wildfires going on in the region. In British Columbia, we'll go to visit Clayoquot Tribal Parks, as well as Doig River's Sequoia National Historic Site. And in Nova Scotia, we'll go to visit the Kluskap Wilderness Area in Unama'ki, Cape Breton. Have any of you been to any of these places here? Show of hands? Okay. Wow, we've got a lot more international travels, yes. Yes, I have had also the good fortune and with gratitude to peoples who have stewarded and loved these lands since time before mine. And through that stewardship, they're still beautiful and available to us to visit today. So the first moose that I mentioned was jurisdiction, and here's an example of overcoming some of those multiple overlapping jurisdictions and working together in partnership. Thai-Denenene, in the Dene language, is known as the land of the ancestors in Dene Saline, and it contains 4 protected area designations. The first is the Indigenous Protected Area under Tlutselke's Dene law. The second is a national park reserve under National Parks Act. And the third and fourth are territorial protected areas and wilderness conservation areas under the Northwest Territories legislation. For a brief history of the struggles here in Treaty 8 territory, there was great resistance from the Tlutselke Dene Nation to establishing a park, because the idea of parks was that it would exclude Dene people from their relationships with the land. And they are very close to the Wood Buffalo National Park and have witnessed what was going on there. So when that relationship started to evolve and change, Tlutselke Dene then approached Parks Canada and the Northwest Territories to establish a protected area by their leadership. And this establishment is made under several agreements. One of them is between Tlutselke Dene and Parks Canada, and another is between Tlutselke and the government of the Northwest Territories, which sets out the guidelines for the governance of these specific areas of Thai-Denenene. The Denene Kui First Nation, as well as the Northwest Territory Métis First Nation and the Yellowknives Dene First Nation are also all signatories to these establishment agreements, representing multiple Indigenous jurisdictions on this area. In terms of the financing as well, a $30 million trust fund provides the conservation financing that's required for that long-term stewardship of this area by the Tlutselke Dene. The partners are also seeking new and innovative funding solutions like carbon offset financing and permanent financing projects. In our next place that we'll visit, we'll look at one of those other innovative funding solutions. We have one of HAT's board members and a special guest here in the front row wearing a shirt that does advertise the Tribal Park Allies. So I'd like to point out that Andy is wearing one of these shirts here that I'll explain what the Tribal, thank you very much, Andy. So what is the Tribal Park Allies? It's a business levy program that's entirely voluntary, and businesses that sign up can proudly display or wear their t-shirts for the Tribal Park Allies in the Clayoquot Tribal Parks. The funds are reinvested into the tribal park in the way of guardianship programs, guardians who are doing trail maintenance and other kinds of program upkeeps. Businesses participate by donating 1% of their revenues to the tribal parks movement, and tourists participate by making donations. When one stays in the tribal park and spending money at participating businesses, including Indigenous-owned businesses, then the funds get reinvested for the nation in finding solutions like keeping people employed and housed in their own community. The jurisdictional moose here is very complex. The Clayoquot Tribal Park has been declared by the nation, and Parks Canada also has a large presence in the area with Pacific Rim National Park. So the mechanics of pursuing legal designation under Crown law are still yet to be determined. There's also a very large element of intergenerational teaching when it comes to guardians, and so we'll look at that next with capacity building. The third moose of capacity building is really exemplified in a trip that I recently went to in Treaty 8 territory in Doig River. And I was able to witness some young people, the next generation, taking care and stewarding their sacred places. This work here at the Charlie Lake Caves, or Sequoia National Historic Site, archaeological work had previously been done by Southerners and outsiders or academic institutions coming in and then taking that information out of the territory. But now the nation is taking ownership of doing that themselves. They say that the Charlie Lake Cave is a portal. It's a sacred place for Doig River and Deneza people. It's been ever since time before mind. Archaeology, or Western science, is corroborating now, just now, these facts that Doig River people have known for years, that they have been there, and carbon dating some of the tools that they've been using is just catching up to this understanding that they've been there for at least 10,000 years or more. The Sequoia Heritage Society also recently unveiled a major space upgrade to make their washrooms and pathways and their gathering places entirely wheelchair accessible. So that means that the care of elders and anyone with mobility challenges, so all nation members, can come and visit their sacred and important cultural places. Speaking of important cultural places and keystone species and places, let's go next to visit Cape Breton, or Unama'ki, as it's known in the Mi'kmaq language. Kluskap there's a legend about Kluskap, who was sent by the Creator as a friend for the Mi'kmaq people, and he lived at Cape Dolphin at the northern tip of Cape Breton Island. The cave was Gloeskap's last home on Earth before he left for the sky world. And this place and its importance has been told in stories to Mi'kmaq people. But today it's been desecrated by graffiti. With public access to this place, anybody can go and visit. And the stories are not being told so that people know the importance of keeping this place sacred. And so the Mi'kmaq people have decided to establish a protected area at their cave. And the following model on the right-hand side is an example of a potential management framework that they have developed. And it's derived from a 2-day workshop held by the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources. They're using a two-eyed seeing approach. This was coined by Elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki, where two-eyed seeing means viewing with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing with one eye, and valuing Western ways of knowing with the other eye, and bringing both knowledge systems together. That's two-eyed seeing. And this is the foundation for the Gloeskap Wilderness Area, which is going to be the first of its kind in Unama'ki territory, and a case study to eventually develop what can be a template for management frameworks for other IPCAs in Unama'ki and indeed around the world. So that's some examples of IPCAs in practice, Indigenous-led examples. We're also going to show some examples of how Indigenous communities are establishing their IPCAs in accordance with Crown law. And some of these ways that Indigenous communities are doing that is under the BC Local Government Act, through official community plans, through Indigenous-led or Crown-led land use plans, through Indigenous-led comprehensive community plans, or community resilience plans, and additions to reserve treaty land entitlements. So that being said, I'm a planner, and so I gravitate towards the plans, and there are many more that I'm not able to cover tonight, but I'm sure that you can think of a few ways that Indigenous communities are doing this establishment. The first example I wanted to show you is right here next door to us in Souk. And you may not know that the municipality has an official community plan containing 4 zones. Some of these zones are the off-limits to development and will remain protected, according to the OCP, based in the Sauk Nation's Indigenous laws. The official community plan is also under the jurisdiction of the BC Local Government Act, giving it its Crown law authority. In the next example, we'll also look at a plan that's completed with the nation's own authority to do planning. This is an example that I'm quite familiar with, where I lived and I worked on Clecho Nation territory in the Northwest Territories. And the Clecho Nation established legal protection of their Indigenous protected and conserved areas also through zoning, just like the previous example of Souk. This has been successful, and the ICE report does state that IPCAs could employ zoning as an approach, and they give this example of Wehe Laxo Diale, which is in the Clecho language, the names for those 2 red blobs there. These are land use exclusion areas that protect sites that are fundamentally linked to Clecho history and heritage. And in this example, the Clecho government first completed their treaty negotiations, and the Clecho Land Claims and Self-Government Agreement that they settled in 2004, it authorizes the Clecho government as the sole authority for land use planning on Clecho lands. But there are instances where land claims have not yet been completed. And so here's an example as well from Kanaka Bar in BC. It's a bit more into the interior. And this is an example of a community resilience plan. So it is not legally binding under Crown law, but for the nation, it very much is. The Community Resilience Plan guides all of the nation's work, including land use plans, climate change adaptation, and protected areas. It's more like a declared protected area that we had seen with the Clayoquot tribal parks, and yet it's still aspiring to be recognized under Crown law. And one of the final examples that I'll show under Crown law establishment is in Treaty 8, returning back to Doig River. Doig River and many nations are using the additions to reserve components to add areas onto their reserve lands where they can then establish protection. And in this example, right in the heart of Fort St. John, Doig River Nation has established the Natchez Commons, and it's one of Doig River's first urban reserves, and it's a priority for the development of land for housing as well as protected areas for the nation. Because of their sacred sites, the development is called Natchez Commons, and it's named after the dreamers and the spirits of the Natchez. These kinds of additions to reserves are also examples of nations working in a rural municipality where there's a growing need for housing and a reconnection to land and lifeways. So I know that we don't have very much time, so I'm going to just flip us from one of these slides to introducing what Indigenous-led can look like in practice. And this is about the management and governance models of IPCAs. It's probably a little hard to see up on the screen, but I'm going to read those out loud. A recent study by Megan U. Dallas that's available on the IPCA Knowledge Basket in 2023 did a scan of several different models of governing and managing IPCAs. So they are to be found solely Indigenous-led, like we'd seen in the Clayoquot tribal parks or Clecho land use planning. They could be Indigenous and Crown government partnership, like we had seen when we went to Thai-Dene-Nene in the Northwest Territories, complex jurisdictional overlaps. They could also be Indigenous and non-governmental organizations. So another example we saw from Chief Frank Brown, and the Heiltsuk Nation, partnering sometimes with NGOs, environmental NGOs, or with educational institutions as well. And this was quite interesting that the Megan Udelis study in 2023 said there were no documented examples of IPCAs operating under a hybrid model of all three coming together. Can you think of an IPCA in the works with a partnership between an Indigenous government, an established Crown government, and a non-governmental organization? I wonder. I can, yeah. And that's the Maryhill IPCA. And the steering committee is composed of these four groups. So the Chenu Nation, the Habitat Acquisition Trust, the District of Metchosin as a municipality, and then Pearson College. And these four partners form the steering committee. And it could be, this is quite exciting, it could be a case study in the first hybrid model. And anytime we have a first, we're forging new grounds, right? So there is unknown steps that we're taking. But it's really promising and hopeful for me that this can forge a new path not only for the Chenu Nation, for you here in Metchosin, but also for all IPCAs around the world. So I know we're going to hear a brief update about Maryhill from Morgan after this. So I'd ask you to save your questions about Maryhill until after Morgan's presentation. Please, let's look at the last two slides that I have, and I'm going to summarize our key learnings from tonight. So our purpose here was, first and foremost, to share and exchange, to receive and give information about IPCAs as a global movement, but also right here in Canada, in BC, and in South Vancouver Island. We've identified our global and domestic conservation goals, and our journey has taken us to IPCAs all around the world that are helping us to reach those goals. You now understand the three essential elements of IPCAs, that they are Indigenous-led, that they elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities, and that they represent a long-term commitment to conservation. As well, you've heard about some of the tools and mechanisms for establishing, managing, and governing IPCAs. My intention for you was that you would leave tonight more hopeful about a future that we are working towards together to find reconciliation within ourselves, with one another, and with the land. So before closing, I invite you all to take another deep breath with me. Let's do that together. In, yes, thanks, and out. And let's just consider the land that we're sitting here and fortunate to be on, because 173 years ago, on May 1st, 1850, approximately 30 chiefs and representatives of Beecher Bay families signed on to the Douglas Treaties. And then almost 80 years ago, during the Second World War, title, according to Crown law, was retained by the federal government, the Department of National Defense. The health of the ecosystem has not been monitored by Indigenous people or anybody from the public for many generations. And today there is an opportunity, a brand new opportunity forging new paths that the Chenu people have. This is their opportunity to reconnect those relationships as part of the treaty negotiations. And so with gratitude, as Jackie has opened up, with gratitude to the Chenu people who have stewarded and loved these lands since time before mine. I also want to say with gratitude and thanks to the Habitat Acquisition Trust, to the Metchosin Learning Group, and to each and every one of you for coming out tonight with your opening your hearts and your minds to this story. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here today. And finally, if you want to learn more information, there's a few links up here that I'll share. There's some videos and websites and research and studies that I've cited in my talk, and so you can find those on the Indigenous Circle of Experts report that's available from conservation2020canada.ca. There's also the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. They co-produced these videos with the Karissa Foundation. And there's many more webinars and videos on the CRP's YouTube channel. There's also the IPCA knowledge basket, and that was that study of the 4 governance models. I really encourage you to sign up for a free account, because then you can read all about the IPCA establishment agreement, and there's many reading lists there. The Indigenous Leadership Initiative, of which Frank Brown is a member, Chief Frank Brown, you can also see a lot more information about how Guardians are taking back stewarding of their lands and special places. I'd mentioned the Karissa Foundation, which are my teachers, and as well my own website, talkingcircle.ca, where you can listen to my podcasts. I have writing and research that I publish and post to that website too.
But there's so much there in what you've introduced us to, and it was so global in scope, and so grounded in very practical examples, so thank you so much.
What is, and I've heard the word many, many times over the years, but what does unseeded mean?
Okay. So from David, he's saying, I'm going to repeat if we don't have the mic here.
Sorry, it doesn't work.
Yeah, okay. So his question is, he's heard the word many times, what does unseeded mean? And I don't know if you want to assume you're the authority on this, but you'll have an opinion, I have no doubt.
I know we also have legal opinion in the room as well, and it is a legal term. Seed, C-E-D-E, means to give up. And in the context of our Indigenous relationships with the land, one doesn't own the land. So one doesn't have the ability to give up ownership of the land or to cede ownership of the land. I think it's a very a much longer answer might be more appropriate if we had time to talk about the signing of the Douglas Treaty here specifically, and how treaties were written.
You can say a word or two about the signing of the Douglas Treaty.
Okay, sure, yeah. I mean, 150 years ago, if the treaties were signed in the English language through translators who did not speak the local languages, or translators who were learning the local languages as a second language, the word ceded, I mean, even for me to explain in English language, maybe doesn't do it justice. But when we acknowledge the land that we are on as unceded, what we are doing, as Jackie has done at the beginning of our talk tonight, she's acknowledged that in no way in signing treaties did nations intend to cede the land. That they always meant to share in the relationship with the land, with newcomers, with settlers. And so honoring the treaty means going back to those original agreements with how we were with the land, and how we can honor those agreements by being in relationship with each other and relationship with the land today. Yeah. I hope that answers your question about ceded.
It was a key thing, because you mentioned earlier in the beginning of your talk about a couple of Indigenous groups that were unceded. You said that. And you didn't actually mention when it was ceded. But I presume, well, I guess it's a legal term for some of the local groups that are Indigenous groups that are unceded in Metchosin, right? Or in Souk. In fact, none are ceded, right?
So David is asking about the status of the word ceded or unceded in the local area, both
Yes.
for Chianu and for the
Right.
Sauk Nation.
Right.
And I don't, do you want to?
I'm actually not familiar with that, so more specific, I can't say whether I'm familiar with the outcomes of modern treaties and how they look back at the previous treaties.
Okay.
But I will give a little synopsis as well. When we have these discussions, even in the English language, and I was having a discussion with someone about the word seeded, and in my mind I heard like a plant seed. And I thought, well, S-E-E-D, and isn't that an amazing seed to plant in our minds as well, about how we are seeding our relationships with the land? Yeah.
And I think it's very difficult, if I can just add, for settlers, or however you want to call yourself, a newcomer, if we've grown up always with the notion of ownership of land, to actually imagine communities that do not think in terms of ownership of land. So it's like such a huge step for us to think differently, and it's a long journey for us to do that. So, another question.
By the way, I'm a member of the Metchosin Learning Group, and we have a YouTube about whether this land is ceded and unceded. We had a presentation, so we can give you that resource. But I was trying to think, You know, you were talking about two eyes seeing, which is beautiful. And I was thinking about one eye is the capitalist economic system that we, in a sort of, it's so pervasive, we don't even know what it, you know, it's just pervades our world. And I was thinking, so that's one eye. And I was thinking, to do with IPCAs, is there another whole, I don't even know if you call it an economic system that has to be made compatible with, or we have to be compatible with ours? Like, are they in conflict? Does one sort of fit in with the other? I mean, it's very, I don't even know if this is a sensible question, but it's like, it's so pervasive. Is there a conflict there? Like how IPCAs managed economically that might be different than what we are so familiar with. You know, which Jackie was saying, like property, individual rights. Those seem quite in conflict with the ideology of IPCAs.
I'm going to repeat what you had just asked about two-eyed seeing and applying the lens of, if we recall two-eyed seeing, Elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki Mi'kmaq from the East has talked about this, and it comes through in the Indigenous Circle of Experts a lot because he was part of that gathering in the East. And I try not to do this where we say this can apply pan-Indigenous wise, right? There is no pan-Indigeneity. Each nation, each culture, if you think about your own cultures in yourself, probably have many different economic models, right? But can we apply two-eyed seeing, which is a particular Indigenous way of looking at things, and a particular Western way of looking at things, and can we use the strengths of both? And are there conflicts? That's a great question, number 2 there. And are there ways to handle those conflicts, or be okay with the conflict and allow it to come through and create something better? And that's a concept I didn't introduce in the presentation, but the concept of ethical space is a meeting of those two ways of being and that system, and the respect for both of them. Respective values of Western ways and the values of a particular Indigenous way. So that's ethical space as an introduction, or maybe a step 2 after investigating a bit more of two-eyed seeing. But I would encourage you here in Metchosin to investigate what were some of the other economic models. What are some of the alternative economic models that existed here in this place? I can speak to some of the ones that I know of from maybe other cultures, but potlatch being one of the ways that nations and communities exchanged wealth. And if we think about economic models as being wealth specific, wealth was not always in a fiat monetary currency way, but sometimes it was in the relationships that you had. If you had a strong set of relationships, you were wealthy. And you establish those relationships over and over again through generosity. So I would encourage you to kind of think about that and investigate here in your communities what were some of the alternative economic models, and how can you look at the strengths of both of those? Because Guardians, for example, or the Tribal Park Allies program is definitely operating in a modern Western economic model sense. It has to. And so it has to in order to exist as a program and as an IPCA. So just consider, like, there's probably some unique ones here that existed, and you might have some of the clues there. Yeah.
Great question,
Yeah.
great rich answer, lovely on that one. Yeah, and it's encouraging to us to be able to stretch our minds about possibilities.
So my name is Valerie Yeager, and I'm a very recent arrival to the Metchosin community, and probably no particular place in the world that I would refer to as home. So home is where I am, and I'm grateful for that here. I will get to my questions. First of all, thank you very much for your talk, which I thought was very rich, both in breadth and depth. And I have no doubt that IPCAs will help Canada get to its 30% goal by 2030, and perhaps is our best shot. Being moderately cynical based on some of my past experience of other levels of government, what my concern would be is that they may be so successful that they sort of take other people off the hook. Maybe it's too easy to say Indigenous people are going to do such a wonderful job perhaps other levels of government therefore don't need to try so hard. And perhaps indirectly there may be a sense of guilt placed somewhere. So I just wondered if that was, it's a little bit orthogonal to your talk, but
Yeah. So I'm trying to imagine an IPCA that doesn't involve jurisdiction, right? Which was one of the moves. That doesn't acknowledge the current complex relationships that we all have, being Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, hybrid people. And so in the examples that I've shown you, some of them are Indigenous-led entirely, but they do rely on partnership and development of further developing those relationships that exist and new relationships as well. Even in some of the Indigenous protected areas that are entirely Indigenous-led, that don't have Crown jurisdiction, there is a role for everybody who participates in that, whether you're traveling through Clayoquot tribal parks, whether you're visiting Quechua lands. There's a role for the partnerships that form for other levels of government. So in no way do I think, does our established Crown governments get off the hook from this. They've made global commitments, and they need to also honor those through the support of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And that support comes through Canadians, each one of us who are Canadians who are able to make a difference in influencing the decisions that our politicians do make. So I'm also really heartfelt that our counselors are in the room today. So I'm really glad to see that there is interest in this and part of the discussion and being part of the discussion, because I hope this continues outside of this room. Not putting counselors on the spot, but I'm saying that if you're interested in learning more about IPCAs, it's a very good first step. And all the topics we've covered tonight, they touch on those relationships with everybody. So it's not, if we have seen examples of Indigenous-led protected areas, they are all built on the partnerships that they've established through other arenas of Crown government too. Yeah.
I love that question, and I just want to nuance it a little bit. And I think it might be that there's a danger of shifting the burden. Not necessarily saying that it lets other levels of government or other individuals or agencies off the hook. But one of the things that I love about the project that we're working on right now is that the whole premise is to not shift the burden, right? Is to say, you know, you've got these lands and they're, you know, being talked about in treaty, and it's some of the last lands that might make sense in a treaty context that are available. And it would not be fair to say, oh, but can you please conserve it without sharing that burden? And so that's one of the pieces that I think is really important to keep mindful of when you're talking about the IPCAs. So yeah, I just think it's a really great opportunity to kind of really slide in there and really kind of sit in that ethical space, right? Like, what does that look like? And how do we kind of do that two-eyed seeing so that those values stay put? So it wasn't really a question, but I loved the question and the opportunity. So I got on my soapbox. I'm gonna get off now, and I'm sure Morgan will elaborate later. So.
I mean, I just want to say, Erin, thank you, because any opportunity we can get to remind ourselves of the special places that we are living, and it is because of those relationships that had been established long, long before, and through Douglas treaties and now modern treaties. Like, each one of those steps was an important step to get us here where we are today. Yeah. So even though it wasn't a question, I say thank you. And I do see another question beside you. I would love for you to elaborate, but I think you were getting to it at the end, was what your question was about, perhaps example of an IPCA, or have there been examples of IPCA of a nation that is also intending to do development? Yeah, okay.
Less conservation, more development.
Right. And the reason I included Doig River is because there's a contrasting example there. Doig River exists in the heart of Fort St. John, and they have territories in a rural municipality outside of Fort St. John. And they're finding ways, and this is part of, I think Erin would say, the complexity of treaty negotiations, is it is no longer about the entire territory that nations used to steward or may continue to steward and as since traditionally, but now they are forced by jurisdictional reasons to choose pockets. And those pockets have many of the pockets are the leftovers of what was already. So if a nation was trying to steward in the way they had traditionally been stewarded, it would be vast areas. And Fort St. John is an interesting complex because there's a lot of development going on there. So Sequoia is a National Historic Site. It's easily accessible from the heart of Fort St. John, but also, so they've protected that as conservation area, but they are also using their additions to reserve opportunity to add on to specific urban reserves where they can build housing for their members. I think that's one example, but the other is also in our neighbors in Sauk Nation have been working with the Isaac Foundation to develop housing solutions for their members too. So there's other examples. I'm not so aware of too many other ones, but a big component of protected areas is coming home, right? And so if nation members had traditionally been living on that traditional lands, then finding a place for them to live, creating homes, creating belonging back on the land is going to bring that nation home again. And that's going to be all the more strength for the Indigenous protected and conserved area. Yeah.
Thank you on that. I'm going to ask a question that sort of does relate to that, but a little sideways on it, which is, can you speak about the challenges that exist in the settler or newcomer communities to the IPCAs that you know about, but also on the other side of that, what have you learned about the process that Indigenous peoples themselves have to go through, and how that raises challenges too?
Okay, great question, Jackie. And I am a hybrid person, so being bicultural, and we tend to think sometimes, especially with two-eyed seeing, is there only two eyes? Sometimes you can think about your third eye.
Or your fourth or your fifth.
Many ways of observing and seeing. And some of the challenges I'd mentioned are the four moves. So the jurisdiction, financial solutions, capacity development. And these things have to be part and parcel of building IPCAs. Otherwise, they won't be successful. Some of the challenges I think for that I've specifically witnessed in my experience working for the Cleachol have a cultural keystone species of the caribou. And many of us in BC are still familiar with the caribou as well. And the barren ground caribou, as they call them, are a red listed species at risk. And this came about through many steps of restriction. And the first restriction was no more harvesting for sport. And the second restriction was no more harvesting for anybody from the south, only those in the territory. And finally, they're at today a restriction of complete ban, except for a few ceremonial harvests at a specific time of year. And that's a blanket restriction across Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And it's been really sad to see because it hasn't resulted in more caribou. There are many other things in addition to just human harvests, but also the land that the caribou roam and travel and calve that are part and parcel of the health of the caribou. But when humans, especially the Indigenous communities who call that a cultural keystone species, when they can no longer harvest this animal, they can no longer teach the next generation how to properly harvest this animal, how to have a relationship with it. And so I think that is one of the hardest things is if Indigenous and settler communities have had relationships with these beings, more than human beings, to have those relationships severed is one of the hardest pieces. And that's why I share that as an example.
And on all sides.
I'm very familiar with Nature Conservancy, and I was wondering with Nature Conservancy and other trusts similar to HAP, whether there wasn't a synergy or a strengthening for your program.
The strengthening, I'm sorry, for me, my hearing is getting a little weak. So what was the last part?
Well, if you had a partnership or a synergy with Nature Conservancy and these other land trusts, they're working for conservation. And seems to me that there would be some sort of mutual beneficial result.
Right, and I'm going to ask Morgan to
And I'm going to say, I swear that Mike is not a plant in the audience. I swear. But that's a perfect segue to what I'm going to be talking about.
Good.
Thank you.
I think you alluded to it. I can't always hear what people are saying. I'm just wondering what are things that the newcomer community can do to Canada.
What a wonderful question. Thank you. As I mentioned, I'm studying this in a mixed class of both newcomer settlers, arrivants, and Indigenous people. But all of us are working towards some or other IPCAs in Canada. And we often get this question, I'll just repeat it, is what might settlers be able to do? And I'm gonna add on, because the question we often are trying to answer ourselves is, what can settlers do as good allies? And I think these resources here specifically about Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So you could start there, but I'm an IPCA nerd, so that's where I start. But also, you can do the homework as well of learning about some of the legislation that I'd spoken about. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and what that means here. And so there are two landmark processes that Canada has been leading: the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and the calls to action, and how those might be applicable to you in your life. Some of them might be applicable to you in your work or your personal life. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls call to action. So these are processes that Canada led in recognition of the harms that our colonial processes have done, in recognition of the ongoing harms that are still happening today. So I think that also taking those steps in doing that work, but not expecting the burden to be on Indigenous people in your communities as well, would be an important thing to recognize. There's an immense burden on Indigenous communities to do teachings, to share, and to give, for example, ceremony acknowledgements. It's something that any one of us could look up and start learning about before approaching, and when approaching an Indigenous community member with a request, to always think in reciprocity as well. And so in asking for something, and what can you give as well. So I think those are a few of my ideas and my tips, but I think it's a great question too, because it shows, how can we take what we're learning today and go outside in support and allyship? And there's a role for every one of us in that as well.
So I'm just going to introduce Morgan, but before I do that, I do want to acknowledge that there are a couple of participants in the meeting today from Chianu, and I respectfully acknowledge their presence, and thank you for joining us. So I want to introduce Morgan Yates, who is a Metchosin resident. He doesn't have to own up. I got it here in the notes. And he's a retired professional engineer. So I always like to find out these different ways in which your life comes together, right? And his interests include environmental stewardship and direct engagement in reconciliation. As a director of the Metchosin Foundation and a volunteer for HAT, he enjoys the opportunity to work on different initiatives that support both of these objectives. From 2019 to 2022, Morgan was HAT's volunteer project coordinator for the Chianu Mary Hill IPCA project, and he continues to be involved as a member of the project steering committee. He probably didn't know what he was getting himself into. So he's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions again. So thank you, Morgan.
Now, before I begin, my colleague Peter with HAT has asked me to remind folks that on the little square table where I think Nietzsche is located right now, there are some business cards that look just like this. Please pick one up before you leave so you can access more information about the Mary Hill project. So Jackie, thank you very much for that introduction. And Jeff, thank you for your excellent presentation and providing a great segue to my update on the proposed Mary Hill project. Before I begin, I wanted to offer a few acknowledgements. Like Jessica, I have borrowed photo images from the Maryhill Project website to include in my slides. And the photos I selected were generously shared by TJ Watt, Bev Hall, Tim Innes, and Carol Voigt. So in her opening remarks, Jackie acknowledged the funders who are sponsoring this evening's event. But I'd like to go back a few years and acknowledge the individuals and the agencies who provided the early capacity funding and the early in-kind support that enabled the Maryhill Project to gain traction and gain momentum. And these include the Victoria Foundation, the Metchosin Foundation, Victoria Natural History Society, Van City, Conservation Alliance, and Tumuk Treaty Association. They also include a Canadian Family Foundation and individual donors who have elected to remain anonymous. But foremost in importance, I'd like to acknowledge our neighbors in Channel First Nation. Understanding the nation's history, its current circumstances, and how little of the nation's territory the Crown will be returning as part of modern treaty negotiations, I find it deeply inspiring that the nation is willing to consider a potential future use for treaty land that would respond to the conservation aspirations of its Metchosin neighbors. It's worth thinking about that. So Jeff, next slide, please. So what is the Maryhill Project? Well, the project is led by Chandler First Nation with support from 3 agencies. And those agencies, of course, are HAT, the District of Metchosin, and Pearson College. It involves 340 acres of Department of National Defense lands that are expected to be conveyed as part of modern treaty negotiations. The goal of the project is to support Chiano community members in making a fully informed decision regarding different potential land uses for Maryhill. The project team is currently working to explore the potential for a near-urban IPCA. Next slide, please, Jess. This map shows the location of the project in relation to some well-known Metchosin landmarks. The red dashed line, the semicircular line, indicates a safety setback radius from the D&D Munitions loading dock, which is located across Pedder Bay on the Rocky Point Peninsula. The dark yellow shading on this map indicates the expanse of sensitive ecosystems, and these include old-growth coastal Douglas fir, Gary Oak Meadows, Rocky Bluffs, shorelines, and wetlands, which are home to a remarkable diversity of species. Next slide, please, Jeff. So in this slide, I'm attempting to summarize at a very high level key steps that were completed in the first 3 years of the project. But in particular, I'd like to emphasize some guiding principles that were developed to help steer the project. All involved parties acknowledge that Chiano must be kept economically whole if the nation elects to pursue a conservation outcome rather than a conventional development outcome for their treaty land. In turn, this means that a future IPCA would incorporate conservation-compatible economic activities. For example, ecotourism, guardian programs, and forest-based carbon credits. Because the project involves future Chiano treaty land, the timing and the content of public communications is subject to input from Chiano leadership. In other words, the maxim, "nothing about us without us," applies. So to provide a real-time example of this last principle, the timing of this particular talk here in Metchosin was chosen to occur shortly after the conclusion of related community engagement activity within the Chiano community. And the focus for this evening is for the project to share information with Chiano's Metchosin neighbors. So with these guiding principles in mind, in that first 3 years, what did we do? Well, we completed a high-level feasibility assessment of an IPCA land use, and in parallel, Chiano undertook an evaluation of conventional real estate development scenarios. Toward the end of the first 3 years of project work, DND formally declared the Maryhill lands to be surplus to their needs and thus available for treaty purposes. Next slide, Jess. So key activities over the next 18-month period, which we're talking about here, included the execution of a standstill agreement, which guided the exclusive and in-depth evaluation of an IPCA land use option, also included detailed economic modeling of conservation-compatible activities, and allowed the undertaking of related internal communication among and between Shadow leadership and members. Next slide, please, Jess. So looking ahead. So the next steps looking ahead from today include a 6-month extension to the standstill agreement to support a further and final detailed level of evaluation work. I am happy to note that this extension was approved in principle at yesterday's Project Steering Committee meeting. Within the next 6 weeks, HAT will begin ramping up activity on a pledging process for prospective IPCA funders. In 2024, there are 2 key milestones that we expect to conclude. Number 1, the Channel community will render its decision on a preferred future land use for Maryhill. And number 2, HAT will complete the prospective IPCA funder pledging process. Next slide, please, Jess. So key steps in 2025 follow directly from Channel Community's 2024 decision on the preferred treaty land use. If the nation decides to pursue an IPCA land use, then in 2025, the formal process to establish the IPCA will begin, and funds pledged by donors via HAT would flow to support IPCA creation. Conversely, if the Channel community decides to pursue more conventional development of the Maryhill Treaty Land, pledged funds would not flow and IPCA project records would be archived. Next slide. So, if you're wondering why this process will take more than 5 years, this slide cites 3 of the main reasons. First, and with a nod to Jessica Hum for allowing me to borrow one of her observations, it takes time to move at the speed of trust, and mutual trust is fundamental to reconciliation. Next, unlike some other IPCA projects, the Maryhill project needs to dovetail with the final stages of an ongoing and complex treaty process. And last, third, the Maryhill model of multi-agency collaboration seems to be quite novel. There isn't an exact playbook to follow, but we do hope that other projects may be able to borrow from the work that we are undertaking. So wrapping up my presentation, I'd like to share a few things I've learned over the past 4 years as a Project Steering Committee member. Number 1, a key purpose of treaty land is to restore socioeconomic well-being among members of the First Nation receiving the treaty land. Conventional federal and provincial parks just aren't set up to do that, but IPCAs can be. Although the acreage involved is relatively small, the return of Maryhill to Channel will be historically and culturally significant. While the ultimate land use decision is the sole purview of Channel members, the decision will be influenced by the evolving and multidimensional relationship between neighboring communities. And like many good things in life, sincere mutual consideration is a great starting place for win-win outcomes. Next slide, which is thank you and questions. And while you might be formulating your questions, I'll ask you to please visit our project website. The website address up there, it's on the business cards at the little square table. And if there isn't time to answer your question here tonight, you can pose your question through the website. With that, over to questions. Niche.
Morgan, question. What is the role of the steering committee? What is your terms of reference?
So, what can you say?
What is the terms of reference of your steering committee? What is the role of the steering committee?
Okay, so the role of the steering committee is to guide the evaluation of a potential IPCA outcome. And we each have roles on that steering committee, and we are now well into our 4th year. So one of the things that's different about our project, of course, is it embodies the First Nation. It includes a local government as a supporting agency. It includes a conservation NGO as a supporting agency, and it includes Pearson College, an educational institution. But our output at the end of the day, Nietzsche, is going to be, for example, the detailed economic modeling of what an IPCA could look like, groundwork on different governance models, that kind of stuff.
And can I ask a question that kind of fits right into what you just said, which is what's the provincial government's relationship to that?
So the provincial government has a tangential relationship through the treaty process, but it has no role at the table itself. That said, I should acknowledge the provincial government has been one of the providers of capacity funding to support this project and its project process over the current year.
Thank you. Yes, other questions? Please.
I'd like to repeat Dan's question she had for Jessica, which is...
Can you just say your name, Frank, please?
I'm sorry.
There's a question being asked by Frank Mitchell, who is indeed a Metchosin resident.
I'll ask this question. She asked, what can, and I'll put it in terms of what you told us, what is it you'd expect from citizens of Metchosin now that we can or cannot do to assist the work of the steering committee or resolving this issue?
I guess my recommendation, Frank, would be to really contemplate the concept I had about it taking time to move at the speed of trust. And so whatever we as community members can do to learn more about Shannon, to learn about that community, to spend time with that community, and then to engage with our own council members in terms of encouraging them to pursue innovation in their relationships with Shannon. I think that's the best way to support the project, is to support the sustaining relationship between the two communities. You're welcome.
I'm Dorothy from Metchosin, and I'm also in the learning group. I'd like to know what you see as the major barriers to this IPCA moving forward.
Honestly, Dorothy, I'm not sure that I see barriers per se. So with the caveat that the ultimate decision on land use for the treaty, land use, of course, Chanus, I would say, although the process has been gentle and we've been moving in kind of a steady arc over a period of many years, I don't feel a sense of there being barriers per se. I take confidence from the process that we have organically created and sustained. I feel good about the work that Chanu did in their real estate development scenarios. I feel good about the work that we're coming close to concluding on economic modeling for the IPCA. So I would say, I'm not going to characterize it as a barrier, but of course, when you're trying to raise a lot of money to enable the IPCA creation, fundraising is always a challenge. But even there, my colleague Peter has engaged a fundraising consultancy out of Calgary who are giving us indications that this is a pretty attractive project, has some pretty interesting moving parts. We need a substantial budget, which number I'm not going to disclose, but there's confidence that the number can be attained.
And maybe you could just say something about why, I don't know if Peter can, why there is specific interest in this type of program.
Well, I'll start on that, and I think it comes down to the fact that, as Jessica pointed out actually in her talk, this is kind of a novel approach, and people seem to be quite excited at the idea that a First Nation-led project is being actively supported by a local municipal government, by a conservation NGO, and an educational institution. That's one of the things that is really attractive. And, you know, I would say if there's anything that may be a little bit of a disadvantage for Chianu in contemplating an IPCA outcome, it's that the acreage is relatively small. But that smallness in acreage is offset by the remarkable richness in biodiversity per acre. It's also offset by the fact that, gosh, we're less than an hour's drive from the BC legislature. It's a pretty accessible IPCA location.
Thank you.
I wonder why there's no national trust in Canada. I never quite understood it, because you're trying to reinvent the wheel here almost. You have to start from scratch. Like, if there was a national trust, you could just say, here's a piece of land we want to preserve, it's worth preserving, here's the reasons. We go to the national trust and see if we can get some money. I guess there isn't such a thing in Canada, is there?
Well, I would say, with due respect to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which I have supported over past years, this is a different nut to crack, David.
Yeah.
Because, and I probably should have said this right at the outset of my talk, it is the intersection between reconciliation and conservation, which is our goal. And if you look at the National Trust model, with due respect to friends from the UK, that's a colonial construct, and it is not going to be getting to the nub of the reconciliation, the very important reconciliation part of the equation. So that's why, and now I'm going to just quickly segue into Mike's question. It's exciting to me to see smaller and more nimble Canadian conservation organizations really looking at this conservation space, and I am honored to be working for an organization like HAT that really got engaged in that early. I can say to Mike of Colwood that NCC is also getting a lot more traction in this area, and kudos to them. They've been a little slower off the mark, but they're making up for it.
One of the things that when you ask that question, what can you do? Well, maybe that's one of them, right? Like, if you think that there's a role for other existing agencies to play here, that they might need to reconsider the way they engage on these kinds of projects. Because sometimes we have these very narrow boxes from a colonial construct that we're trying to fit in, and we can't always make those fit with the parameters that they've been set up with. So to the extent that you have a relationship with any of those parties, that's a great step that you can take.
Okay, I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
What's the, I'm going to ask this question when I ask it, it's going to be there. What is your assessment of the market value of the land?
I'm not going to tell you.
There you go. I know it was sitting there.
It's a big number. There's lots of zeros behind it. And just think about where it is. 340 acres of beautiful land, oceanfront views. It's a big number.
Yeah. And I have another question to ask you about the land, which is, I'm curious about, like, I've never been there because I assume I can't go there. And is that also true for the Chianu Nation? They cannot access the land?
That sadly is true, Jackie. So, and I think that was a point that Jessica touched on actually briefly in some of her conversation, that around World War II, all access to that land was sterilized for Chianu. So that really important cultural connection has been gone for generations. So, with due credit to the current folks administering DND, they are working, I would think, collaboratively with Chianu to enable visits to Mary Hill, but it's not the same as having, agency over Mary Hill.
I was just remembering a trip we made to Mary Hill with the chief of the Chianu Nation. And he was saying that it was the first time he had been on the property. Right?
Yep,
So
it
was extraordinary.
And considering that, it's extraordinary that there's been so much depth to the process so far, given that lack of access. Diana, you have a question?
In your presentation, Morgan, you said it's really important to make Chianu whole, or however you put that. And you're saying parks don't do it, but IPCAs can. And I just wondered how, I'm not sure if it's crude, just how can they get economic benefit from an IPCA?
It's not crude at all, and in fact, it's one of the things that I have a particular interest in. So I'd mentioned
engineering background.
Exactly. So I had mentioned, one of the important undertakings during the period of the standstill agreement, and a reason that it's been extended, is because we have done quite a detailed evaluation of the discounted cash flow and the employment that can be generated by conservation-compatible activities. And at the risk of appearing to be a wonk, dealing with numbers and such, what we're looking at is comparing the discounted cash flow outcome from real estate development to the discounted cash flow outcome from conservation-compatible activities.
So could you just give an example, like a layperson's example?
So an example would be, and this is actually a really recent one, so the field of voluntary carbon credits is changing quite quickly. And in fact, we just had the economic analysis on carbon credits done. Again, I'm not going to share the detailed numbers with you because that's confidential to the project, but it was, in my view, unexpectedly robust. And to me, I've actually mentioned to the district of Metchosin, to the interim CAO, that this is something we should probably get on the radar for Metchosin as well, that the changing field of voluntary carbon credits is creating new opportunity. So that's one example. Another example are, there are guardian programs, for example. We need guardians on the land to make sure that land is treated in a respectful manner by the people who visit it. Guardian programs create some wonderful employment, and it's an employment ladder. It goes from junior to senior employees, so that's another one.
Thank you for that.
I have one more addition, and it's just going back to the four moves, because I think part of making Chianu whole is making sure that all four moves are there, although maybe we would go with like the bear or some other,
A Roosevelt elk, I think.
We don't have moose or meese or whatever my kids would say. But that's one of the really exciting things about an IPCA through a process like the modern treaty process, because it really does also do the jurisdictional piece, the capacity piece, and the reconciliation piece, which Chief Chips will be the first to say is one of the most exciting things to come out of this process, and really do that. Like, we're living in ethical space, I think. Which I've kind of forgotten about, so thank you for reminding me that that is a thing that we're doing, but you just don't think about it because you're in it day to day. So I think that's what keeping Chianu whole really looks like, not just the economic piece, although that's really important.
Good.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. And I really want to thank you, Morgan. I mean, I've only just got to know you, but I have a pretty strong sense of how much work that you put into this project, which is a labor of love in addition to an intellectual and a commitment labor. And so I really want to hold
Just want to acknowledge how honored HAT is to be able to be here in this community. This is a community HAT has been working in for many years. And there's an important person that should be recognized as well. That's Katie Blake. Katie Blake took on this project very early on behalf of HAT. She's worked so hard working with all the people that you recognize here, including Morgan. So I think just in her absence, she wanted to be here, but she's done so much. So for HAT, this is one of the leading projects within its portfolio. It really represents what, the coming together, what reconciliation looks like, what community engagement looks like, and most importantly, what conservation looks like. So when you ask about what can you do to help move this project forward, particularly working with the Chianu, I think about what Chief Chip says, and that is really to walk together in friendship. And it's really about friendship that's at the heart of this project. And if you could do anything, be friends with your neighbors in a meaningful way. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Metchosin Learners Group for being here. And
one question?
Sure.
Can individuals donate to HAT for the Mary Hill project at this point?
Yes, they can. Thank you, and I didn't ask.
She
yes,
wasn't a plant.
You can do that. There are a couple of mechanisms on how you could do that. You can go directly to the HAT website. There is a big red donate button you can go through. If you feel like there's a bit more of maybe a communication or an engagement process, you're welcome to go to the website. There's a messaging, ask for me, Peter Ord, and then I'll personally talk to you, sit down, have coffee, go for a walk, show you Mary Hill, and not the actual site that's of course that's under D&D, but show you some areas, and we can engage that way. But certainly we are looking to engage on a financial basis. In the long term, anything counts, and of course we will let you know where that goes and how it's used over time.
Great.
But thank you. And thank you again, Jackie, for being a wonderful, wonderful coordinator. Thank you to Karissa, who's taking this video. This will be on YouTube. Thank you to Morgan for your update. And thank you so much to Jessica for your wonderful presentation. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
I'm Diana Smith. I'm part of the Metchosin Learning Group. We're a small group. We're about 11 people. We've been together about 10 years, 2 years. And I think it was because of a passion or just wanting to, just feels so outraged about what's happened with Indigenous people, colonialization, and being part of, responsible for that. And you mentioned the word homework, and I think really what we're doing is homework. We wanted to do it for ourselves, but the kind of people we are, we also wanted to include anybody, but people in the chosen particularly. And so we put on public events about revitalization of language projects. We had a whole presentation about seeded and unseeded because people wonder, is it unceded land? Is it seeded? Very important question, and it's very complicated. We're putting on 2 public events in September and November, and if you're on our contact list, you'll hear about it. We put articles in the Metchosin Muse, and we're going to try and look at anti-Indigenous racism from our point of view, what we can do about it, and look in our hearts about that. And Jackie and Janet Gray are going to lead this because they've got tons of experience. So it's a very difficult, sensitive area that we just want, but very, very, very important to tackle that. And so that's what we're going to do. And so we do things for ourselves, and we do public events too.
Thank you, Diana. Peter got everybody, I think, pretty well, except Allison. Where are you, Allison? Over here. Allison, who has definitely been the chief sheep herder, I think, of the organizing for this event. Allison is
Oh, amazing. Thank you.
by Janet Gray.
Wow.
Through all of these in her garden.
Yes. Well, thank you I'll take a little piece of the chosen.
And I look